Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello everyone, let me welcome you to today's session of the course The History of English Language and Literature. In today's lecture, we are continuing to look at the long 18th century, focusing on the age of Johnson, which lasted from 1745 till 1798. In the last couple of sessions, we had also been looking at how the early 18th century had been fashioned, what were the major influences, socio-political, religious, societal, other scientific elements, how the age of enlightenment also contributed to the development of English language and literature. We had been taking a look at all of these things in the last couple of sessions, and today we continue to look at how the latter part of the century has been framed and has been fashioned in terms of its writings, in terms of its literary influences, the various shifting tendencies of the people, the politics, the writings, so on and so forth. In the beginning of the 18th century, there was also a moral reaction against the license which followed the Restoration period. We noticed that much of the writings of this period was also characterized with this reactionary nature, and we saw how it was also dominated by the formalism of the age of Pope, during which period reason and good sense prevailed as the guiding principles, and there was also a deep distrust of the emotions and the feelings. Writings accordingly had become harder and drier in comparison with the earlier times. As a result of the reactionary forces against the elements of Restoration drama and the licentiousness of the period, people also developed a certain kind of dread against earnestness and enthusiasm. Accordingly, there was also a domination of flippancy, cynicism, and the age in general was considered as mostly self-complacent. And this is also reflected in the writings of Addison and Steele, which also had a minor form of social criticism. We also saw it heavily getting reflected in the writings of Swift, which was mostly misanthropist in nature. In the context of all these changes and all these movements which were coming about, Hudson remarks, the new generation now in its turn reacted against the smug self-complacency, the chilliness and the aridity of the preceding age. So we begin to see that by the mid 18th century, there is again a reaction, a sort of a response against the dominant tone of flippancy, the dominant tone of cynicism, and also the formalism and the dryness which had crept into the writings of the times. So just as we have noted in the discussion of our previous centuries, every age seems to react to the preceding age in some form or the other. So whatever happens in the latter half of the 18th century is again yet another reaction to the tendencies of the early 18th century. So the generation which came after the age of Pope, they were weary of the long continued artificiality and also displayed a lot of discontent with formalism. So we also find them reacting against the shallow philosophy of the Augustan age. But the writers who were writing during the age of Pope, which was also known as the Augustan age, they strongly believed that they were following the tenets of the ancient classical writings. They also thought that they were more philosophical and they were more profound and in-depth than their predecessors. We also find them reacting against even the writings of the golden period, the Elizabethan age. In that sense, having witnessed how the writings had become more formalist, more imitative to the classical tendencies, we find that the generation after Pope craving for something more natural and spontaneous and not intellectual and artificial. So in that sense, we also witness a renaissance of feelings during this time, and accordingly this age is also seen as an age of transition which marked the changes from the formalist tendencies of the age of Pope towards the more spontaneous expressiveness of the Romantic age which is yet to come. For example, this sort of change was seen in almost all spectrums of life, including religion. We find that there was a sort of evangelistic revival which swept across Britain during this time. It was led by primarily by Wesley and Whitefield. We find Hudson talking about it in a very interesting way. He notes the evangelists cared nothing for decorum and the proprieties where the eternal destiny of the soul was at stake. So, so even in the religious discussions and the religious tendencies of those times, we find a marked difference in the sense that in the early 18th century, the focus was more in convincing someone through an argument. But in the latter half, with this evangelistic revival, we find that there is also a focus on trying to move by feeling rather than by arguments and through rational arguments. One of the major events which also marked the beginning of such an evangelistic revival was the successful staging of this particular play, Handel's Messiah, in 1743 in one of the stages in London. This was hugely successful, and later historians do note this event as an index of the coming age. In the latter half of the 18th century, we also find a prolific spreading of the humanitarian spirit. We find a rapid growth of democracy, which is also a phenomenon which we witness in other parts of Europe as well. And we also find that people begin to celebrate the ideals of liberty, equality, and rights, and also they begin to expose the evils of the existing social state. So, compared to the previous age, which was more cynical in its response to most of these evils which were happening in society, we find that the present age, the generation which was living during the latter half of the 18th century, we find them more responsive and trying to stage a lot of protests against the existing evils in society. So, in that sense, it was also a period of a lot of social and political unrest. We find people reacting against the brutality of the system, brutality of the society in general, and there's also an increased stress on individuality and qualities of character. We also find that there is an increased stress on individuality and qualities of character. People begin to focus on things which are acquired rather than the qualities which are acquired by birth and through breeding. So, there is a lot of moving away from the aspects of nobility, from the aspects of aristocracy, and focusing on the individual irrespective of the background from which each one has hailed from. And we also find the tremendous influence of Rousseau, and we also know that he was the one who influenced the French Revolution quite a lot. And we find that the Rousseau's influence is particularly seen in the way in which the writers are responding to his call to go back to nature. So, we find at a later point, even with the advent of Romanticism, this influence was quite profound and visible throughout the writings and throughout the various sort of cultural reflections. On the whole, we find that in the latter half of the 18th century, after the age of Pope, the writers, the thinkers, and major influential cultural proponents of those time, they challenged the powerful traditions of the preceding Augustan age. One of the most important figures of this period was Samuel Johnson, so much so that the age itself gets named as the age of Johnson. He lived from 1709 to 1784 and is considered as the greatest English man of letters after Pope and before Wordsworth. So, he also signaled a certain kind of transition, not just in literary writings but also in the development of language. He was born as the son of a bookseller. He worked as a school usher for a time. He also did in the earlier days of his career, in order to make a living, he also did some translation for a Birmingham publisher. We also get to know that he married a widow who was 20 years his senior, and after a while together as a family they tried to establish a school of their own, but it was quite unsuccessful. He also falls into a lot of misfortune as a result of that, and in between he's also forced to leave college, which was the Pembroke College in Oxford, due to lack of funds. And as a result of these many unkindly things which were happening in his life and the unpromising way in which his life was moving ahead, In 1737, he decides to move to London to try his fortune. It is said that he moved to London with just two pence and half a penny in his pocket. He, however, was fortunate to have the company of David Garrick, who was also a former pupil of his, and he also had later become one of the most renowned actors of those times. He was fortunate to have the company of David Garrick, with whom he is also said to have lived for a while until he could establish himself in London. If you look at the career of Johnson, we note that he was many things rolled into one. He was a poet, an essayist, a moralist, a literary critic, a biographer, an editor, a lexicographer, because of which the historians do feel that he was arguably the most distinguished man of letters in English history. In terms of his religious beliefs and his political affiliations, it's important to note that he was a devout Anglican, he was a committed Tory, and in terms of his literary achievements, he is also considered as a great champ of literature, and he was also an acknowledged dictator of those times when it came to matters of literature, culture, society, and all things related to letters. About his personality, there was a lot of people have noted about a strange phenomenon. Many have written about how some of his odd gestures and tics were seen as disconcerting to many who came to visit him. It was also the result of him not developing good relationships with some of his contemporaries. Later historians have also assumed perhaps that he had this Tourette's syndrome, which was a certain kind of a neuro disorder which was not yet diagnosed then. So, some of the unusual kind of behavioral patterns that Johnson displayed, it could have been because of this Tourette syndrome, which was not diagnosed. Talking about his literary capabilities, he published his first poem in 1738. It was also titled London. This poem had 263 lines, and since he was a very avid admirer of the classicists, this was an imitation of Juvenal, the Roman poet. The first poem was published anonymously, and it also ran into multiple editions, and he was also fortunate to have received much critical acclaim from Pope, who did believe that he was one of the greatest writers of those times. And Johnson himself, in fact, was increasingly unhappy with the first edition, which was published in 1738. We find him revising it again in 1748, much to the discomfort of many others who felt that the first one was much better than the later revised edition. And in this poem, we find a certain a kind of a nostalgic glorification of English history, in a sense that he was trying to praise the earlier governments and the earlier monarchs in comparison with the present ones who were ruling the 18th century, and because of which he also ran into a lot of controversy with the Hanoverian government and Robert Walpole, who was the Prime Minister de facto. It's also useful to remember that the government was mostly Whig oriented, while Johnson had a lot of affiliations towards the Tory party. And maybe because of these reasons, maybe because he had managed to offend the ruling party right at the beginning of his literary career, he managed to receive some sort of a recognition and financial assistance only much later in his life. During this period, we also find him establishing a connection with one of the former publishers of those times, Edward Cave, who also was running this particular magazine known as the Gentleman's Magazine. Johnson used to regularly contribute to the parliamentary reports for this magazines, and it's important to remember that during those times parliamentary reporting was banned, but nevertheless he manages to contribute to this column on a regular basis. Again, it's interesting to note that Johnson himself was never in the gallery of the house. He merely worked up his debates from the notes of others. So, we also get to know about the kind of immense genius that he possessed right from the beginning in order to fashion everything according to his convenience and also begin to write according to what the public wanted. And an important note about this particular magazine, the Gentleman's Magazine, is that it ran for about 200 years since it was established in 1731. This was quite a rare feat, since most of the periodicals and magazines which began in the early phase of 18th century and even in the early 19th century, they could not manage beyond a few decades at the maximum. Some of the other important writings of Samuel Johnson include one of his earliest defense of the Theatres Licensing Act. This was in 1737. He also writes a poem, Vanity of Human Wishes, in 1749, which is also considered as one of the best of his poetic works. In 1737, he wrote a tragedy titled Irene. In 1750, just like Addison and Steele, we find him beginning this periodical titled The Rambler. It was also an imitation of The Spectator. The Rambler used to appear on all Tuesdays and Saturdays till March 1752. He used to work on this single-handedly, and it was also quite successful, though it did not achieve the kind of popularity that Addison's and Steele's periodicals used to get. He also published two more periodicals titled The Adventurer and The Idler. Perhaps the most important work of not just Samuel Johnson, but the most important work of the 18th century itself was the publication of a dictionary of the English language. The dictionary came out on 15 April 1755 to also mark the beginning of a new phase in the history of English language. In June 1746, seeing the possibility of standardizing English language, we find that Samuel Johnson, who was by then quite a renowned figure in London, he was contracted by a group of London booksellers to write a dictionary, and he was offered 1,500 guineas, which is equivalent to 1,575 pounds, and in today's terms it would be 220,000 pounds. So, it was such an enormous sum of money which was offered to Samuel Johnson for beginning his work on this particular dictionary, which was quite a novel work in English language then. During this time, the French people had already come out with a dictionary of their own, which was published by their Academy of Letters. But we find that these English booksellers, they do find that there is a possibility of a new market in terms of if they manage to come out with the dictionary. They also realize that this is a huge project which they cannot fund on their own. So, they kind of come together, form a collective, and commission Johnson to do that. Johnson also was quite smart enough to see the possibility and also to identify a possible market in this. And by 1747, we begin to note that he had written out a plan complete with his intentions and his methodology, and he begins to work on this. Though initially he thought that he would be able to complete this work in about 3 years, we see that he takes about 7 to 8 years to complete this work. Nevertheless, this is considered as one of his greatest contributions to English language and literature. He had worked on it single-handedly, and this was a remarkable feat not just during those times but even in today's terms. He only had employed some clerical assistants to help him with certain clerical work, and there was also several revised editions which came out even after it was published in 1755. This dictionary which was produced, it was very large and it was expensive. In terms of its dimensions, it was 18 inches tall, 20 inches wide. It also used the finest quality paper available then. The cost was, one dictionary was about 1,600 pounds. So, we do find that it was very expensive or not affordable to the common reader. Only certain academies and institutions could buy it then. What made Johnson's dictionary quite distinctive is that it was not just a set of definitions and meanings. It was also a rich mine of quotations, references, and it was also seen as more of a literary artifact than a linguistic artifact. You do find that it was not just about meanings and etymologies, it was also about including a lot of references from contemporary literary texts. Johnson's dictionary also has this rare distinction of having laid the foundations of English lexicography. Though there is a criticism that this work was quite weak in etymology and philology, but nevertheless we also need to keep in mind that these subjects were still in their infancy in the 18th century. Johnson's dictionary had a lot of very curious kind of definitions which also had a tinge of humor in them. For example, he talks about lexicographer as a writer of dictionaries, a harmless drudge, and oats as a grain which in England is generally given to horses but in Scotland supports the people. This obviously also had irked the Scottish people quite a bit. And patron is commonly a wretch who supports with insolence and is paid with flattery. If we this is a page from Johnson's This is a page from Johnson's dictionary. For example, if we take a look at this, the meaning of the particular word oats, we find that apart from the meaning, he also gives a lot of references from certain contemporary texts. He quotes from Miller, Shakespeare, Locke, Mortimer and Swift. Yeah. So, this is quite an impressive archive of literary texts as well, because he refers to most of the texts of those times which had some reference or the other to this particular word oats. And we also, it is important to note that among his literary quotations, he quoted Shakespeare more than any other writer. Here we also note that Johnson's dictionary, which ran into multiple editions, it also had a miniature form which came out in 1796. So, we do find that this also was one of those books that people really wanted to own during those times, because there was no other reference book which could be used in order to understand words, usages, coinages, and it was also an interesting resource book for referring to various other forms of literature and writings. Boswell, who wrote the biography of Johnson, the life of Johnson, he speaks about an interesting anecdote in the context of the writing of the dictionary. Allow me to read out an excerpt from this. Dr. Adams found him, that is Dr. Johnson, one day busy at his dictionary when the following dialogue ensued. Adams says, "This is a great work, sir. How are you to get all the etymologies?" Johnson, "Why, sir, here's a shelf with Junius and Skinner and others, and there's a Welsh gentleman who has published a collection of Welsh proverbs who will help me with the Welsh." Adams, "But, sir, how can you do this in 3 years?" Johnson, "Sir, I have no doubt that I can do it in 3 years." Adams, "But the French Academy, which consists of 40 members, took 40 years to compile their dictionary." Johnson, "Sir, thus it is. This is the proportion. Let me see. 40 times 40 is 1600. As 3 to 1600, so is the proportion of an Englishman to a Frenchman. With so much ease and pleasantry could he talk of that prodigious labour which he had undertaken to execute." Here we also note that this was the kind of response that he had to any kind of situation, no matter how difficult or how grand it was, and this he thus also was rightly named as was also rightly named as the greatest in that particular age. One particular incident marked a lot of difference in terms of the literary patronage system of the 18th century, and this was Johnson's response to one of his patrons. Johnson, in fact, was very late in getting any kind of patronage from the wealthy nobles of those times, and we are noted many times in the earlier sessions that throughout history we find that always there were particular patrons or wealthy gentlemen who were acting as patrons to promote arts, literature, culture, etc. So, the artists were always at the mercy of these powerful, wealthy people, and when Johnson began his work on this particular dictionary, he had contacted Philip Stanhope, the 4th Earl of Chesterfield, who also initially promised to help him out, but we find that for a long time he neglected him greatly, and the Earl of Chesterfield also did not keep up his promise. But however, towards the end of his work, when his dictionary was about to get published, we find Chesterfield again approaching him and also offering to help him financially. However, in between Chesterfield also had written quite bitterly about the ongoing work on the dictionary in a couple of newsletters and periodicals which were prevalent during those times. Johnson also harbored all of those ill feeling against Chesterfield, and just when Chesterfield offered some amount of money towards the end of the completion of the work, Johnson wrote this particular letter in response, and this has also become quite famous for the way in which a literary writer treated a patron in the 18th century. So, this is how the letter reads: "7 years, my lord, have now passed since I waited in your outward rooms or was repulsed from your door, during which time I have been pushing on my work through difficulties of which it is useless to complain, and have brought it at last to the verge of publication without one act of assistance, one word of encouragement, or one smile of favour. Such treatment I did not expect, for I never had a patron before. Is not a patron, my lord, one who looks with unconcern on a man struggling for life in the water, and when he has reached ground encumbers him with help? The notice which you have been pleased to take of my labours, had it been early, had been kind, but it has been delayed till I am indifferent and cannot enjoy it, till I am solitary and cannot impart it, till I am known and do not want it. This particular letter which Johnson wrote to Chesterfield in the 18th century, it was a major event then. It was also an encouragement to many of the artists and writers of those times, and it's also said that this event marked the death blow to the whole 18th century system of patronage. And the dictionary also made Samuel Johnson financially quite independent. He began to even earn £300 a year as pension. It also showed the other writers and artists of those times that it's possible to earn one's livelihood through one's artistic and literary means as well, without completely relying on the wealth of the patrons. Nevertheless, the dictionary did have some limitations. The most important one was that it was not an exhaustive work compared to their later works, but however one also needs to keep in mind that Johnson worked with limited resources in the 18th century. And the other important fact was that Johnson was quite conservative in his approach of including words. For example, he only recognized a word as illegitimate only if it had some respectable literary currency. Certain words which he thought were of low profile or did not have enough literary quality did not make it into his dictionary. For example, because of those reasons, he had excluded words such as fun, stingy and clever, but we know that at a later point of time they all became part of proper English vocabulary. Samuel Johnson also founded the club in 1764. This was mostly a literary club where the eminent personalities of those times used to get together, have dinner together and also discuss about the major socio-political affairs of those times. They used to meet regularly at the Turk's Head Inn in Gerrard Street. The major members of this club included Joshua Reynolds, who was a renowned painter of those times. He is also said to have been one of the founding members of the club. Oliver Goldsmith, Edmund Burke, Gibbon, Sir William Jones, who was the Orientalist, Garrick the actor, and also Boswell, who was a hero worshipping friend of Johnson, who also later wrote his biography. The club's toast was Esto Perpetua. When translated from Latin, it was Let it be perpetual. But nevertheless, we do find that the club did not have a very long life. Nevertheless, they did contribute to a lot of discussions and a lot of major thoughts. We can say that it had sprung from this club headed by Samuel Johnson. The other major works of Johnson include Rasselas, which was a didactic novel which he published in 1759. It's said that he had written Rasselas quite quickly to pay off certain debts that he had accumulated. And in this work, we also find his sense of deep religious faith, which he claims to have saved him from utter hopelessness throughout his life. In 1765, he also published an edition of Shakespeare. In 1775, A Journey to the Western Islands of Scotland, which was also more like a travelogue. In 1765, he published a preface to Shakespeare, which is also considered as the first and major critical essay on literature. This was quite important and controversial in the sense that we find him slighting Sterne, who was one of the earliest novelists. He undervalued Milton's work and he also displayed a lot of prejudice against Swift. Many feel that this was also because of the political rivalries that they had during the time. In 1779-81, we find him coming up with this another significant work on criticism, the lives of the most eminent English poets with critical observations on their works. In that sense, we find that Johnson was important not just in laying the foundations of language, but also in laying the foundations of literary criticism of English literature. The most important work about Johnson has been his biography written by Boswell in 1791, titled The Life of Johnson. Johnson's style of writing was very different from that of his predecessors or of his successors, which is why, as we noted at the beginning, he is also considered as one of the greatest men of letters. His vocabulary was very Latinized and it was also pompous and heavy, but at the same time it was not flippant, it was not superficial, it was also noble and dignified. This had prompted Macaulay to even coin a term Johnsonese to talk about this dignified and noble style of writing. Macaulay's observation about Johnson is quite apt, as in when we begin to wind up this session. Macaulay once wrote, "The memory of other authors is kept alive by their works, but the memory of Johnson keeps many of his works alive." On this note, on this celebratory note about Samuel Johnson, we begin to wind up this session, and we also shall continue to look at other eminent personalities of the 18th century who marked a transition towards the romantic period of the 19th century. So with this, we wind up today's session. Thank you for listening. Look forward to seeing you in the next session.